So our last speaker of the morning will be Dr. Bill Gurley, who is a professor of pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences College of Pharmacy. He is director of the UAMS Clinical Pharmacokinetics Research Laboratory and chair of the UAMS Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee and vice chair of the UAMS Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences. His research interests include mechanisms of herb-drug interactions, toxicity of multiple component herbal dietary supplements, phytochemical modulation of human drug metabolizing enzymes and drug transport proteins, pharmacokinetics of phytochemicals in humans, and botanical supplement use in special populations. His presentation today will be on interactions between supplements and drugs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gurley.
All right, so I want to thank the Office of Dietary Supplements for inviting me to speak again. I've been here countless times, and I certainly enjoy it, and hopefully they won't run me off after this particular presentation. But nevertheless, plants have certainly been a source of drugs since time immemorial. But the issue of drug interactions really didn't come to the forefront until after the Second World War, when drugs moved from multi-component plant-based preparations to purified single-ingredient synthetic compounds. Now, if you delve into the medical literature like I often do, it's obvious that phytochemicals have been recognized for their ability to modulate human drug metabolism for many decades. And I think one of the most interactions most often described is the ability for cruciferous vegetables to modulate certain drug metabolizing enzymes that can prevent the activity of certain environmental carcinogens. I think a group they're quite familiar with are the isothiocyanates. But the concern for herb-drug interactions really didn't come to the forefront until 1991. And it was that year that grapefruit juice was found to increase the oral absorption of many drugs and possibly their toxicity by inhibiting one of the most important drug metabolizing enzymes in the intestine, and that's one called cytochrome P450-3A4. And just a quick survey, you guys familiar with the whole grapefruit juice issue? Okay, very good. All right, I just want to make sure that, all right. But soon after the grapefruit juice issue came into light, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed. And then a plethora of unique phytochemicals became available for consumption in the United States in the form of botanical dietary supplements. Now, the issue of herbal dietary supplement drug interactions really kind of started coming to the forefront in 1998. And it was that year that an article appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the article was about alternative medicine use in the United States. And then the authors estimated that in 1997, 15 million adults took prescription medications concurrently with herbal remedies or high-dose vitamins, which is a substantial percentage, around 18%. Now, and the authors also went on to estimate that nearly 3 million adults aged 65 years or older were also taking conventional medications with dietary supplements. And because the elderly are our greatest consumers of conventional medications, then they may be at an increased risk for herb-drug interactions. Now, you probably have already heard quite a few surveys about dietary supplement use in this practicum, and certainly may hear some more tomorrow. Roughly about half of all the citizens in the United States use some type of dietary supplement. Most of the times those are vitamins and minerals, but nevertheless, a number of other surveys indicate that between 30 and 60% of all hospital patients use botanical supplements on a regular basis. And I think as a pharmacist, one of the most important surveys that, to me, is the fact that almost 20 to 30% of all prescription drug users also take botanical dietary supplements on a regular basis. And as healthcare professionals, I think it's one of the most important statistics to take away is the fact that still, and I've been following this statistic for quite some time, and it kind of stays around 40%. Around 40% of all patients never reveal the fact that they're taking botanical dietary supplement to a healthcare professional, so that can oftentimes be quite problematic. Now, there are a whole host of reasons, that may contribute to herb-drug interactions, and I think a fairly obvious one is that the more botanicals you're exposed to, and if you're taking conventional medications, the greater the likelihood that there may be an interaction. And of course, not only we're talking about single ingredient dietary supplements, but also multiple ingredient dietary supplements can certainly increase the likelihood. And of course, you also have to realize that herbal dietary supplements are oftentimes formulated with concentrated plant extracts. All right? So they take the plant material, grind it up, and oftentimes extract it with either hot aqueous solutions or sometimes organic solvents, and concentrate a lot of these unique phytochemicals, then dry that off and formulate it as a powder or a tablet or capsule or whatever. So you're being exposed to much higher concentrations of some of these unique phytochemicals than you would if you just consumed the plant in its natural state. And of course, a lot of the phytochemicals that we oftentimes run across, we know very little about their pharmacological activity. All right? And so a nice example in terms of just complexity is just Panax ginseng. There have been over 500 unique phytochemicals found in Panax ginseng, and several of, in fact, I would say the vast majority of those, we know very little about the pharmacological activity. Now, to kind of hammer that point a little more, this is just a partial listing of some of the known phytochemical constituents in St. John's wort extract. And of course, you can see there's flavonoids and essential oils. And of course, the flavonoids are ubiquitous throughout the plant kingdom. But a lot of species will have their own unique phytochemicals that may not be found in any other species. And St. John's wort is a great example of that. And there are a few categories like the naphthodienthrons we see there on the left-hand side of the screen. But at the bottom, you'll notice I've got one highlighted in orange instead of yellow. And that's a compound called hyperforin. And we're going to talk about hyperforin a little bit later. All right, but it's a very unique compound that makes St. John's wort very problematic with regard to herb-drug interactions. Now, all right, so how do you initially recognize whether or not a botanical or a dietary supplement is going to pose a risk for an herb-drug interaction? Well, oftentimes our first indicator comes from case reports that appear in the medical literature. Now, a single case report really can't establish causation, and in fact, a lot of epidemiologists would argue that no case reports can establish causation. However, if you start to see numerous case reports reporting the same thing, there's probably some merit to that. All right? But nevertheless, case reports oftentimes can kind of help you establish a hypothesis to test in the future. And this also holds true for the adverse event reports that are submitted to the FDA through their MedWatch program. And of course, if you do research in this area and follow the literature, there's a tremendous number of papers that are publishing in vitro results. And Dr. Krisner talked about some in vitro issues earlier. And that is, of course, if you expose a cell line that expresses a drug metabolizing enzyme or a transporter, or if you utilize purified enzymes and such, if you expose them to a high enough concentration of a phytochemical or to an extract, you're going to see an effect of some sort. All right? Now the question is that clinically relevant? And the problem is with most in vitro studies is that they don't translate very well. In fact, I would say the vast majority of them don't translate to the in vivo condition. And so to me, the most definitive means for assessing clinically relevant herb-drug interactions is to actually do prospective clinical studies in humans. Now, I know those can be very expensive, but nevertheless, they can be quite definitive in their studies. And so what I'm going to share with you are several studies that we've done over the years to illustrate some of these principles. All right, now, there are two major categories of herb-drug interactions. The first general category is called a pharmacodynamic interaction, and that's just a situation where the botanical has a pharmacological property either very similar to a conventional medication, therefore it may exacerbate the conventional medication's effect, or it has an effect just the opposite of the conventional medication, and therefore may negate its effect. So I want to just give you two examples of some pharmacodynamic herb-drug interactions that are well recognized. And the first one involves the ephedra-free dietary supplements. Now, you guys may remember, some of you may be too young to remember the ephedra wars, as I like to call them. But back in the early, when the Shea first came out, from 1994 until 2004, ephedra-containing dietary supplements were on the market. And ephedra is a plant source of a group of drugs like ephedrine, pseudoephedrine, and phenylpropanolamine, and a few others. And the ephedra-containing dietary supplements also contain natural sources of caffeine. And it just so happens that caffeine and ephedrine is a pretty potent combination. Well, the problem with ephedra dietary supplements is there were a lot of serious adverse events linked to their use. Issues of heart attack, stroke, seizures, psychosis, even some deaths. Some deaths of some college athletes and some professional athletes. And of course, then you had this media frenzy going on, and pretty soon sales of ephedra-containing dietary supplements started to plummet. Well, of course, the dietary supplement manufacturers are not fools. They just said, okay, we'll just take the ephedra out and leave everything else in, maybe add a few other things. And so the ephedra-free products started to catch up with and soon surpassed their ephedra-containing predecessors with regards to sales. Alrighty, now, so the question is, are these ephedra-free products any safer? And so the typical components that you find in ephedra-free supplements today are primarily natural sources of caffeine, although you will find some other natural sources of other sympathomimetic agents like synephrine and phenylethylamines and yohimbe and such. But nevertheless, the typical caffeine sources include guarana, green tea, kola nut, yerba mate, and several others. And oftentimes combinations of those, and even throw in some synthetic caffeine to boot. And it's not uncommon for a lot of these products to have pretty substantial amounts of caffeine, as much as 3 to 6 cups of coffee. So the question is, are these high-dose caffeine-containing products any safer? Alrighty, so now, as I mentioned, the FDA took the ephedra-containing dietary supplements off the market in 2004. All right, but soon after that, you started to see eerily similar case reports appearing in the medical literature with these ephedra-free dietary supplements. So here again, issues of heart attack, stroke, seizures, exertional heat illness, and such. So now the question is, well, maybe ephedra wasn't the entire problem. All right, so I want to share with you one of the few studies that have actually been conducted with ephedra-free dietary supplements. And so we looked at 3 very popular ephedra-free supplements. One was called Xenadrine EFX, Metabolift, and then Xantrex 3. And you can see there on the upper left-hand side, they're fairly complex formulations. All of them had guarana as their natural source of caffeine. So we also utilized guarana as a comparator in the study. And you'll notice that at the bottom of each column there is some numbers in red. And so the first number is just the amount of caffeine per capsule. And then the second is the amount of caffeine you would consume if you ingested that product per label recommendations over a 24-hour period. All right, and so the amounts range from anywhere from like 500 milligrams of caffeine to well over a gram. And so the way the study was set up is we looked at 12 healthy male adults, and they were randomized for a supplement sequence over a 6-month period. And there was active phases and a 2-week washout phase in between. And we monitored them for heart rate, blood pressure, and EKG activity. And so we monitored EKG activity. We had them wear a Holter monitor under their shirts during the active phases of the study, as well as during some of the washout phases. Right? And so, not too surprisingly, given the quantities of caffeine that are in these products, as well as some of the other natural sympathomimetics, we saw significant elevations in systolic as well as diastolic blood pressure, and certainly a heart rate. But during the active phases of the study, we saw a lot more abnormal EKG activity than we did during the washout phases. And so, nothing to get too concerned about, but nevertheless, we saw some extra runs of VTAC, a few inverted T waves, things like that. And of course, not too surprisingly, there was a lot of complaints of insomnia and anxiety and nervousness. And there was a couple of products caused a lot of nausea and vomiting, and that was a little bit concerned us. And so when we were analyzing the products for caffeine content, 2 of the products literally ran us out of the lab. They stunk so bad. And so my technician says, we may have a bacterial contamination here. And sure enough, we sent the products down to the National Center for Toxicological Research, which is also an FDA regional laboratory in Arkansas. And sure enough, 2 of the products were loaded with some bacillus species, levels of like 4 times 10 to the 8th colony-forming units per gram. So it was a substantial number, one of which was Bacillus cereus, which is a known human pathogen. So I felt really bad about subjecting my guys to those things, but we didn't know. I mean, it wasn't on the label has Bacillus cereus. I mean, I just didn't do that. So the bottom line is that although these products may be ephedra-free, they may not necessarily be trouble-free. Right. And so with regards to the whole pharmacodynamic herb-drug interaction mechanism, another product that we run across on occasion is licorice root extract. Now, we're not talking about licorice candy. There's not enough of the compounds in licorice candy to do anything. But a lot of dietary supplements, particularly weight loss supplements, will have licorice root extract as one of their components. And licorice root has some interesting phytochemicals, one of which is called glycerizic acid. And when glycerizic acid is consumed, it's metabolized to an active metabolite called glycerotanic acid. And what these 2 compounds do is they inhibit an enzyme called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Okay, well, what does that do? Well, that normally converts cortisol to cortisone. And so when you inhibit that enzyme, you have higher cortisol levels, and cortisol has a higher mineralocorticoid effect. And so you have a tendency to retain sodium, lose potassium, and invariably, if you're on a licorice extract for a long enough period of time, and there have been numerous studies to show this, you will develop hypertension. And so individuals that are trying to lose weight but also may be on an antihypertensive medication, if you're taking one of these products that has licorice extract in it, then it may actually be negating the antihypertensive effects of some of your other medications. It may also negate some of the antiarrhythmic properties of certain medications as well. All right, so those are just two examples of the ephedra-free supplements, and the products that contain licorice extract may have some pharmacodynamic interactions. So you certainly wouldn't want to take particularly the ephedra-free supplements with prescription stimulants like Adderall or Ritalin. And of course, you wouldn't want to take either of these with regards to antihypertensive medications. All right, so the next major category of herb-drug interactions are those that have a pharmacokinetic mechanism. And what do we mean by that? Well, basically, this is a situation where the phytochemicals present in the supplement can either affect either the absorption, distribution, metabolism, or excretion of a conventional medication that may be consumed with it concurrently. And what we're talking about specifically are situations where phytochemicals can modulate the activity of human drug metabolizing enzymes that are found primarily in the gut and in the liver. And these are things like the cytochrome P450 enzymes, the UDP glucuronosyl transferases, glutathione transferases, sulfatases, and there's just a whole host of others. But they can also, these phytochemicals can also modulate transporters, not only the efflux transporters, but also uptake transporters. And these can also be found in the liver, in the gut, and also in the brain. All right, this is one of the reasons why we have a blood-brain barrier, is because we have these efflux pumps that are in the endothelial cells of the cerebral vasculature that if a drug diffuses into it, it can pump it back out. All right, so we'll look at some examples of these. All right, now, for those of you that may not be familiar with drug metabolism to any great extent, there are a wide variety of drug metabolizing enzymes, as I mentioned. One major category are the cytochrome P450s. And other cytochrome P450s, these are the principal ones that we find in humans. And the most important one in humans is one called cytochrome P450 3A4. And the reason 3A4 is most important is because about half of all conventional medications are metabolized to some extent by 3A4. The next most important one is like 2D6, followed by CYP2C9. Right. Now, just to kind of give you an example, utilizing this cartoon to illustrate how modulating the activity of these enzymes and transporters in the gut and in the liver can affect drug bioavailability. So our example here utilizes a drug called felodipine. Felodipine is an antihypertensive medication, a calcium channel blocker. And so we're seeing there when it's swallowed, it eventually gets into the small intestine, where it comes into contact with these enzymes and transporters in the enterocytes of the small intestine. And it just so happens that felodipine is a substrate for 3A4, and 3A4 is highly expressed in the gut. And so when felodipine starts to go across the gut mucosa, it's metabolized extensively. And looking at our little diagram here, maybe only 30% of our original dose gets across the gut mucosa. From there, it goes to the liver through the portal system, gets exposed to even higher concentrations of 3A4, and maybe only 15% of our original dose reaches the systemic circulation to elicit a pharmacologic response. Now, if we take a botanical, let's say if we take a botanical with felodipine that inhibits 3A4, classic example is grapefruit juice. In that case, less of the felodipine is being metabolized in the gut, and so a larger percentage reaches the systemic circulation. And so in the case with felodipine, you may triple the bioavailability of felodipine if you take it with grapefruit juice, because you're inhibiting that enzyme in the gut. On the other hand, if you were taking it with a supplement like St. John's wort that induces cytochrome P450 3A4 in the gut, then much more of that drug is going to be metabolized in the gut and in the liver. And so instead of, say, 15% reaching the systemic circulation, maybe only 5% or less. So those are kind of the possibilities that can come about. And if you look at it strictly from a pharmacokinetic perspective and look at blood levels of these particular drugs taken with phytochemicals, let's look at what can happen. All right, so here we've got classic pharmacokinetic profiles. The yellow curve there in the middle basically illustrates a classic dose versus dosing regimen. So we've got a certain dose of a medication given every, say in this case, 24 hours. And so if you follow that consistently, you will reach what's known as a steady state. Right? And so those steady state blood levels hopefully will fall within what's known as a therapeutic range. So you want your levels above a minimum effective concentration, but below a maximum safe concentration. And so if the regimen is designed properly, that's what will happen. Now, what you have to understand is that those concentrations at steady state, particularly for drugs that are metabolized extensively by the cytochrome P450s and other drug metabolizing enzymes, those concentrations at steady state are a function of the activity of those enzymes. Right? So in the green curve at the bottom is a situation where we've induced the activity of those enzymes such that when less drug gets absorbed, what does get absorbed gets metabolized more extensively. Half-lives get shorter, less drug accumulates, and so it may render the drug ineffective. On the other hand, if we have a situation where we're inhibiting those cytochrome P450s or other drug metabolizing enzymes, then more drug gets absorbed, the half-lives get longer, more drug accumulates, and you might have some toxic manifestations. All right? So this is the kind of spectrum of possibilities with regards to these pharmacokinetic or drug interactions. All right, so let's look at some examples. Far and away, the most problematic botanical with regards to seriously clinically relevant herb-drug interactions is St. John's wort. Now, high-quality St. John's wort is also a fairly decent antidepressant. In fact, several studies have shown that it's as effective as the tricyclic antidepressants and even the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. However, it's notorious for causing herb-drug interactions. Now, back in the late 90s, we were one of the first groups to prospectively study a lot of the very popular botanicals with regard to their ability to modulate human drug metabolism. And one of the very first ones we looked at just happened to be St. John's wort because it was so popular at the time. And so what these two diagrams show here are the effect of a 30-day course of St. John's wort on the activity of that very important enzyme 3A4 in humans. And so the blue circles just represent before and after cases for individuals, and the red lines and circles just represent the average values. And so not only we did studies in young cohort as well as an elderly cohort, and in both instances, we saw about 100% increase in the activity of the enzyme, which was quite surprising to us. We almost kind of scratched our head and said, is this real? But nevertheless, it was what it was. And so you might ask yourself, well, okay, so what? You saw an increase in the activity of the enzyme. Is that clinically relevant? And so literally, a couple of weeks after we finished this young cohort study, I got a call from one of our transplant surgeons at our transplant center in Little Rock. And he calls me up on the phone and says, hey, Gurley, man, I know you work with that herbal crap. I got a question for you. He actually used a little harsher expletive than crap, but it had the same number of letters in it. So, anyway, so he said, do you think St. John's wort will interfere with cyclosporin? Well, let me tell you a little bit about cyclosporin. Cyclosporin is an immunosuppressive drug that literally revolutionized solid organ transplants. And it has a narrow therapeutic window. So if the levels are too low, you may risk losing the graft. You may reject it. If the levels are too high, you run the risk of kidney damage. But cyclosporin is also a substrate for 3A4, as well as one of these important efflux pumps called P-glycoprotein. So keep that in mind. So I said, so do you have transplant patients on cyclosporin and St. John's wort? And he goes, yeah. And I said, I said, I bet the cyclosporin levels are really low. And there was a long pause on the phone. And he goes, yeah, how did you know that? And so I want to show you what this is. So this is the cyclosporin trough concentration profile for a 28-year-old white female who was 5 years post-kidney transplant. And because cyclosporin has a narrow therapeutic window, she'd have to come to the clinic once a month and have her cyclosporin levels drawn. And so for the longest time, you can see there that her levels were within the desired range. But around Christmas time in 1999, her cyclosporin levels started to plummet. And so she was already on 100 milligrams twice a day, and they were like, well, this is odd, and they started bumping her dose up, and then asking her, are you being compliant? Are you taking any other medications? Hey, I'm taking my medications. I'm not taking anything else. Couldn't figure out what was going on. The levels just kept going down. Finally, she started to show signs of acute rejection. This really got everybody in a bit of a tizzy. And finally, she revealed to the dietitian on the transplant team, well, I've been taking this St. John's wort because I was a bit depressed. You think that might have, this might be what's causing all the angst with the transplant surgeons. And that's what prompted the call to me. And so unfortunately, so once they got her off the St. John's wort, she was already on high doses of cyclosporin. Her cyclosporin levels kind of skyrocketed. They finally got them back under control. Unfortunately, her acute rejection devolved into chronic rejection, and she lost her graft, so she go back on dialysis and back on the transplant list. And this is just one of 4 cases that happened in our transplant center. Now, not all of them lost their graft, but all of them were adversely affected by St. John's wort. And so when we published that case series in 2000, literally just a few weeks and a couple months after that, there were other transplant centers from around the world reporting the same thing, that St. John's wort taken by their patients were causing not only kidney transplant rejection, but also heart and liver transplant rejection. So this interaction was especially clinically relevant. All right. So what is it about St. John's wort that makes it so problematic? Well, remember that little compound I mentioned earlier, hyperforin? Well, hyperforin is a unique phytochemical found in St. John's wort, and here's the structure of it. And it's really interesting because what hyperforin does, without getting into a lot of the molecular pharmacology, it turns on the genes for these enzymes and transporters. It binds to a transcription factor called PXR. And so when it binds to PXR goes to the nucleus of the cell and turns on the genes for these enzymes and transporters. And it just so happens that hyperforin is the most potent ligand for PXR ever discovered. Prior to that, we were always concerned about rifampin. Rifampin is a classic anti-tuberculosis drug, and it's notorious for its ability to turn on these drug-metabolizing enzyme genes. And it's a ligand for PXR as well, but not nearly as potent as hyperforin. Alrighty. Now, I mentioned the efflux pump, and so there's a very important efflux pump called P-glycoprotein. And so a lot of drugs are also substrates for P-glycoprotein. And a classic one is a drug called digoxin. And digoxin has a narrow therapeutic window as well. It's not used as much as it used to. It used to be used for congestive heart failure, but nevertheless, it's a classic substrate for P-glycoprotein. And we did some studies looking at effect of St. John's wort and rifampin on digoxin pharmacokinetics. And in both of these curves here, the black squares just represent digoxin by itself. And the one on the left is digoxin plus 600 milligrams of rifampin a day. And so the green circles just show you the area under the curve. And it's dramatically reduced with 600 milligrams of rifampin. But over on the right is with hyperforin or St. John's wort. And we can see about the similar reduction in the area under the curve. But it's just 24 milligrams of hyperforin. All right? So it just goes to show you how potent that stuff can be. All right? So again, the reason this is important is because 3A4 and P-glycoprotein are responsible for the metabolism and transport of about, over half of all conventional medications. And as I mentioned, hyperforin appears to have some role in the antidepressive properties of St. John's wort. And for the longest time, St. John's wort was standardized to another compound found in it called hypericin, because hypericin is real easy to measure. Right? Hyperforin is quite difficult to measure. It's heat and light sensitive. But so oftentimes, if you knew the hypericin content, they didn't tell you anything about the hyperforin content. Now, however, most St. John's wort products are standardized to hyperforin, and the reason for that can be shown here. So we analyzed several brands of St. John's wort back in the day for both hyperforin and hypericin content. And because they were all standardized to hypericin, you can see that on the far right-hand side there, most of the hypericin content is pretty consistent. But look at the hyperforin content. It's all over the map, from as little as 1 milligram almost to 14 milligrams per gram. Right? But look at product A. There's 2 different lots of product A, and the hyperforin content varied by almost a factor of 4. Right? Now, when you start to get around levels of hyperforin of around 10 milligrams per gram, you have some significant induction of those enzymes and transporters. So you can see certain products were more problematic than others simply because of the hyperforin content. And this is pretty consistent with just about any phytochemical in any dietary supplement. There's a lot of variability, not only among manufacturers, but sometimes even between lot numbers. All right, so again, St. John's wort turns on 3A4. It turns on several other cytochrome P450s, as well as the efflux pump P-glycoprotein and several other efflux transporters. We saw how it affects cyclosporin. We saw how it affects digoxin. It makes the anticoagulant warfarin less effective. There have been a lot of miracle babies associated with the use of St. John's wort because it enhances the metabolism of birth control pills. And just a partial list here, even cancer chemotherapeutic agents are adversely affected with St. John's wort. So you can certainly see that the consequences are quite numerous because it renders most drugs ineffective. Now, just the opposite of St. John's wort is golden seal. Right? And so golden seal is oftentimes used to prevent colds and upper respiratory tract infections. But a lot of folks like to use golden seal to mask the results of urine drug screens. And it's quite effective for certain drugs of abuse. but it makes other drugs of abuse easier to detect. So if you're going to be abusing medication, illicit medications, and you want to use golden seal, damn well better know how that stuff's metabolized, because it may get you put in a pokey. All right. But the thing about golden seal is that it's just the opposite of St. John's wort. It inhibits some of these very important drug metabolizing enzymes and transporters. And so here's just some data from a few studies we did several years ago looking at the effects of golden seal on these two important drug metabolizing enzymes, 3A4 and 2D6. And we saw about a 40% reduction in the activity of those enzymes. Now, instead of showing you a modern day example of an herb-drug interaction with golden seal, I'm also a Civil War historian, but I'm also really interested in Civil War medicine. And so when I ran, well, before I get into that, let me just talk a little bit about what actually is in golden seal that causes it to be problematic. And so I'll hold off on my example. There are two compounds in golden seal that makes it problematic. A compound called hydrastine and another one called berberine. Right? And by inhibiting these two enzymes, 3A4 and 2D6, those are the two most important drug metabolizing enzymes in humans. So you can see the ramifications there. So here's hydrastine and berberine. Right? And so you'll notice that I've got one portion of the molecule enclosed by this broken circle. And that part of the molecule is called a methylene dioxyphenyl functional group. And the reason I have that circle is because that's the portion of the molecule that interacts with the enzyme to shut it down. These are what's known as mechanism-based inhibitors. So when these things are metabolized by cytochrome P450-3A4, they bind to the enzyme and shut it down. And the only way you can overcome that is to make new enzyme. Right? So it takes quite a long time for that to happen. Alrighty? Now, here's my example. All right, so when the Civil War broke out, the federal authorities blockaded all the southern ports, and it stopped the influx or the importation of quinine. And quinine was the miracle drug of the mid-19th century America because a lot of folks, particularly in the South, had malaria. And quinine was the only thing that was effective in treating malaria. And so the Confederate Medical Department put out an edict to all of its surgeons in the fields to try to find some indigenous plant in the South that could be used as a quinine substitute. And there was this great effort that went on the whole war. They never found a good substitute for quinine, but they did find that if you took quinine and what little quinine you had with golden seal, you didn't have to take as much quinine and the effects lasted longer. And the reason for that is because quinine is a 3A4 substrate. So I thought that was really cool when I ran across that. So anyway, so this is actually a beneficial herb-drug interaction that was being utilized 150 years ago, although they just didn't know why it was going on. All right. So now, with regards to these phytochemicals that have these methylene dioxyphenyl functional groups, these things are ubiquitous in the plant kingdom. And the reason for that is because these phytochemicals that have these functional groups are really good insecticides. Right? And that's how plants prevent bugs from chewing on them and stuff. They make these really cool, phytochemicals, many of which have these methylene dioxyphenyl functional groups. Well, there's another one that we're probably all familiar with, and that's black pepper. And so black pepper has a group of compounds called the piperamides. Now, don't worry about garnishing your food with black pepper if you're going to get some kind of drug interaction, because it's not going to happen. There's not enough of these piperamides in just a ground up black pepper. However, in a lot of weight loss supplements, you will see the purposeful addition of black pepper extract. And the reason for that is to inhibit drug metabolizing enzymes in the gut so other phytochemicals can be more readily absorbed. Right? So this is just an example of the effect of black pepper extract on one of the anti-HIV medications called nevirapine. Nevirapine is a non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor. Has a real nasty side effect profile. And so here you can see the lower curve is just nevirapine by itself. The upper concentration time profile is nevirapine plus black pepper extract. You can see a tremendous increase in the area under the curve, and so that would likely increase the side effect profile of nevirapine. Alrighty. Continuing on with our methylene dioxyphenyl theme, and there's another plant that's getting a lot of popularity, that you're starting to see it being used in a lot of weight loss supplements, and that's Schizandra chinensis. Now, these are just a few of the phytochemicals found in Schizandra, but you'll notice that all of them have this methylene dioxyphenyl functional groups. And yes, as you might expect, these things can inhibit a very important drug metabolizing enzymes, particularly 3A4. So here's another one, a drug called tacrolimus. Tacrolimus is kind of taken over where cyclosporin left off. It's an immunosuppressive drug and used in solid organ transplants, and it has a narrow therapeutic window as well. And so the broken line there is just tacrolimus area under the curve by itself, and the other one is tacrolimus plus schizandra extract. And so here, you can see the tremendous increase in the area under the curve. And so this would be another clinically relevant herb-drug interaction. All right, now what's really cool about these methylene dioxyphenyl functional groups is that when you take them acutely, they're very potent inhibitors of a lot of these cytochrome P450 enzymes, but the longer you're on them, it looks like they start to induce a lot of the cytochrome P450s. And so you may have this whole spectrum of situations where you may toxicity initially and then render medications ineffective on the longer you take them. So it's quite interesting. But nevertheless, as long as you're not taking any other medications, these are probably fine. But if you're taking other medications, you better be careful. All right, now another one that's quite interesting, and that's the effect of green tea on nadolol. And so here again, if you look at the curve there on the left, you'll notice that it looks like green tea lowers the area under the curve for nadolol. So you would think, well, okay, it's inducing the metabolism of nadolol, just like St. John's wort would. Unfortunately, nadolol is not metabolized. So what's going on? Well, just in this case, what's happening is green tea is inhibiting the uptake of nadolol through some of these uptake transporters that we find in the gut. All right, and so green tea can certainly reduce the activity of nadolol. All right, and how does that happen? Well, there's a group of compounds in green tea called the catechins, and the catechins are notorious for inhibiting a lot of these uptake transporters. And it's important because green tea is one of the most popular beverages in the world, and green tea is also a very prominent component in a lot of weight loss supplements, so it can be exposed to high concentrations of some of these catechins. All righty. A couple of others and we'll finish up. Resveratrol. You probably have heard of resveratrol. It's a compound purportedly in red wine and grape skins and such. And for the longest time, it was thought to be one of these miracle supplements. But we're seeing now that very high doses of resveratrol appear to inhibit some important drug metabolizing enzymes, particularly 3A4, but most importantly, one called 2C9. But it's not the resveratrol itself, it's actually a metabolite of resveratrol, the sulfate metabolite, that appears to be the culprit here. And here's an example looking at the effects of resveratrol on a drug that's metabolized by 2C9 called diclofenac. And diclofenac's a really potent non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, and it has a fairly narrow therapeutic window for non-steroidals. And here you can see the concentration time profiles for diclofenac by itself, and then diclofenac plus resveratrol. So again, another example of a probably clinically relevant herb-drug interaction. Now, you might say, well, my goodness, all these things have the potential to cause some type of significant interaction. That's just not the case. It looks like the majority of the more popular botanicals that are on the market don't appear to pose a significant risk for herb-drug interactions. However, we've really only scratched the surface with regards to the number of these products that have been evaluated prospectively in a clinical setting. Right? Now, the reason that a lot of the more popular botanicals don't pose a significant interaction risk is because a lot of these phytochemicals have very poor water solubility, and they just don't go into solution to be absorbed. And then others that are absorbed quite readily are metabolized extensively in the gut and in the liver, and so their systemic levels are really, really low, sometimes non-existent. However, their metabolites are there, and oftentimes we may see some effects from their active metabolites. All right, so the dietary supplement manufacturers recognize the fact that a lot of these phytochemicals have very poor oral bioavailability. And so there are unique technologies that are being utilized to improve their bioavailability, things like incorporating them into liposomes, complexing them with phosphatidylcholine into structures called phytosomes, making self-emulsifying drug delivery systems and incorporating them as nanoparticles, and then, as I mentioned earlier, just purposely adding natural inhibitors of drug metabolizing enzymes like piperine. All of these things can improve the oral bioavailability of a lot of these unique phytochemicals. The question is, all right, that might certainly improve their efficacy and or effectiveness, but it also might make them more problematic. And because heretofore, those drugs have been fairly their bioavailabilities have been very low, and now they may be quite large, and who's to say that doesn't increase their risk for herb-drug interactions? We don't know because no one's done any study for these yet. I've been trying to get funding for that, but that's been kind of difficult. Anyway, so to conclude, botanical supplements can indeed interact with conventional medications. The interactions may be either pharmacodynamic or pharmacokinetic in mechanism. And it looks like most of the popular botanicals don't pose a serious risk for herb-drug interactions. We did illustrate some of the more problematic ones. But again, a lot of these products haven't been evaluated in vivo. And again, these novel dosage forms may be game changers for a lot of these popular botanicals that at this point, in their traditional formulations, don't appear to pose a risk. And with that, I'll also leave you with some information resources, some websites about interactions if you want to. And I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you. That's another reason I like to come here. I always get a standing ovation.
I was wondering how much do we know about the drug metabolism enzymes of the botanicals?
Where are you at? Okay, so ask your question again. I was trying to find you. I'm sorry.
So this was a great talk. So we know a lot about the CYP450s for drugs, obviously. Mm-hmm. I was wondering how much do we know about the CYP450s and also the phase 2 for the botanicals?
Great question. And so a lot of you'd be surprised at how many phytochemicals are metabolized by cytochrome P450s. A lot of the polyphenols that you see in a lot of undergo significant conjugation, and so the short answer to your question is significant. A lot of phytochemicals are metabolized through phase one reactions via cytochromes or some of the others, but a lot of them also undergo significant conjugation reactions as well. Sulfate. In fact, probably the most common metabolites that you see with regards to phytochemicals are either glucuronides or sulfates. And it looks like of those two, a lot of the sulfates also appear to be active in many instances. So that's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
I have a comment and a question. Back around 2000, when there were some small studies showing that St. John's wort affected the therapeutic window of protease inhibitors, the evidence there wasn't a lot of evidence, but it was so impressive. We had a clinic, a nutrition clinic at a needle exchange, and we pulled St. John's wort out of all of our formulas. And I feel vindicated in having done that.
Yes.
My question is about licorice. Mm-hmm. And so licorice is used a lot in anti-inflammatory formulas. And herbalists recognize that there is a problem with glycyrrhizin and blood pressure. And so by removing the glycyrrhizin from licorice, it seems like from your talk that it would actually increase the anti-inflammatory effect rather than decrease it.
Of course.
I mean, that would suggest it.
Yeah, so glycyrrhizin, that's not the only phytochemicals in licorice, as you well know.
Right, I know.
Yeah. So when you take those components out of licorice, you certainly take away that issue with regards to the hypertensive aspects of it. Whether or not that improves the anti-inflammatory aspects of licorice, you may be more familiar with that literature than I am. But
there
isn't
any literature on that.
Okay,
but
then
it
there
does
we go.
seem
So
like
the
it would
jury's
increase
still
the production of cortisol.
But I'm just guessing. And one quick comment, now I understand why there is a traditional use of turmeric and black pepper together as an anti-inflammatory.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.